Thomas Jefferson, April 13, 1743 – July 4, 1826, was an American statesman, one of the founding fathers of the United States and the principal author of the Declaration of Independence. He served as the third President of the United States, 1801–1809, and was elected the second Vice President of the United States under John Adams, 1797–1801. A proponent of democracy, republicanism, and individual rights who motivated American colonists to break from Great Britain and form a new nation, he produced formative documents and nation-building decisions at both the state and national level. Jefferson was primarily of English ancestry, born and educated in colonial Virginia. He graduated from the College of William and Mary and briefly practiced law, at times defending slaves seeking their freedom. During the American Revolution, he represented Virginia in the Continental Congress that adopted the Declaration, drafted the law for religious freedom as a Virginia legislator, and served as a wartime governor, 1779–1781. He became the United States Minister to France in May 1785, and subsequently the nation's first Secretary of State in 1790–1793 under President George Washington. Jefferson and James Madison organized the Democratic-Republican Party to oppose the Federalist Party during the formation of the first party system. With Madison, he anonymously wrote the controversial Kentucky and Virginia resolutions in 1798–1799, which sought to embolden states' rights in opposition to the national government by nullifying the Alien and Sedition Acts. As president, Jefferson pursued the nation's shipping and trade interests against Barbary pirates and aggressive British trade policies. He also organized the Louisiana Purchase, almost doubling the country's territory. As a result of peace negotiations with France, his administration reduced military forces. He was re-elected in 1804. Jefferson's second term was beset with difficulties at home, including the trial of former Vice President Aaron Burr. American foreign trade was diminished when Jefferson implemented the Embargo Act of 1807, responding to British threats to U.S. shipping. In 1803, Jefferson began a controversial process of Indian tribe removal to the newly organized Louisiana Territory, and he signed the act prohibiting importation of slaves in 1807. Jefferson mastered many disciplines, which ranged from surveying and mathematics to horticulture and mechanics. He was a proven architect in the classical tradition. Jefferson's keen interest in religion and philosophy earned him the presidency of the American Philosophical Society, and even though he shunned organized religion, Jefferson was influenced by both Christianity and deism. He was well versed in linguistics and spoke several languages, founding the University of Virginia after retiring from public office. A prolific letter writer, Jefferson corresponded with many prominent and important people throughout his adult life. His only full-length book is Notes on the State of Virginia, 1785, considered among the most important American books published before 1800. Although regarded as a leading spokesman for democracy and republicanism in the era of the Enlightenment, Jefferson's historical legacy is mixed. He owned and profited from several plantations which were worked by slaves throughout all of his adult life. There is evidence that after his wife Martha died in 1782, Jefferson fathered children with Martha's half-sister Sally Hemings, who was his slave. Some modern scholarship has been critical of Jefferson's private life, pointing out the contradiction between his ownership of slaves and his famous declaration that all men are created equal. He continues to rank highly among U.S. presidents. Presidential scholars and historians generally praise Jefferson's public achievements, including his primary authorship of the Declaration of Independence, advocacy of religious freedom and tolerance in Virginia, and his oversight of the Louisiana Purchase. Early life and career. Thomas Jefferson was born on April 13, 1743, April 2, 1743 Old Style, Julian Calendar, at the family home in Shadwell in the colony of Virginia, the third of 10 children. He was of English and possibly Welsh descent and was born a British subject. His father Peter Jefferson was a planter and surveyor who died when Jefferson was 14, his mother was Jane Randolph. Peter Jefferson moved his family to Tuckahoe Plantation in 1745 upon the death of William Randolph, the plantation's owner and Jefferson's friend, who in his will had named him guardian of his children. The Jeffersons returned to Shadwell in 1752, where Peter died in 1757. His estate was divided between his sons Thomas and Randolph. Thomas inherited approximately 5,000 acres, 2,000 ha, 7.8 square miles, of land, including Monticello. He assumed full authority over his property at age 21. Education. Jefferson began his childhood education beside the Randolph children with tutors at Tuckahoe. In 1752, he began attending a local school run by a Scottish Presbyterian minister. At age 9, he started studying the natural world as well as 3 languages, Latin, Greek, and French. By this time he also learned to ride horses. He was taught from 1758 to 1760 by Reverend James Morey near Gordonsville, Virginia, where he studied history, science, and the classics while boarding with Morey's family. Jefferson entered the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia, at age 16 and studied mathematics, metaphysics, and philosophy under Professor William Small. Small introduced him to the British empiricists including John Locke, Francis Bacon, and Isaac Newton. Jefferson improved his French and Greek and his skill at the violin. He graduated 2 years after starting in 1762. He read the law under Professor George Wythe's tutelage to obtain his law license, while working as a law clerk in Wythe's office. He also read a wide variety of English classics and political works. Jefferson treasured his books. In 1770, his Shadwell home was destroyed by fire, including a library of 200 volumes inherited from his father. Nevertheless, he had replenished his library with 1,250 titles by 1773, and his collection grew to almost 6,500 volumes in 1814. The British burned the Library of Congress that year. He then sold more than 6,000 books to the library for $23,950. He had intended to pay off some of his large debt, but he resumed collecting for his personal library, writing to John Adams, "I cannot live without books." Lawyer and House of Burgesses. Jefferson was admitted to the Virginia bar in 1767 and then lived with his mother at Shadwell. In addition to practicing law, Jefferson represented Albemarle County as a delegate in the Virginia House of Burgesses from 1769 until 1775. He pursued reforms to slavery. He introduced legislation in 1769 allowing masters to take control over the emancipation of slaves, taking discretion away from the royal governor and general court. He persuaded his cousin Richard Bland to spearhead the legislation's passage, but reaction was strongly negative. Jefferson took 7 cases for freedom-seeking slaves and waived his fee for one client, who claimed that he should be freed before the statutory age of 31 required for emancipation in cases with interracial grandparents. He invoked natural law to argue, everyone comes into the world with a right to his own person and using it at his own will. This is what is called personal liberty, and is given him by the author of nature, because it is necessary for his own sustenance. The judge cut him off and ruled against his client. As a consolation, Jefferson gave his client some money, conceivably used to aid his escape shortly thereafter. He later incorporated this sentiment into the Declaration of Independence. He also took on 68 cases for the General Court of Virginia in 1767, in addition to 3 notable cases: Howell v. Netherland, 1770, Bolling v. Bolling, 1771, and Blair v. Blair, 1772. The British Parliament passed the Intolerable Acts in 1774, and Jefferson wrote a resolution calling for a day of fasting and prayer in protest, as well as a boycott of all British goods. His resolution was later expanded into a summary view of the rights of British America, in which he argued that people have the right to govern themselves. Monticello, Marriage and Family. In 1768, Jefferson began constructing his primary residence Monticello, Italian for Little Mountain, on a hilltop overlooking his 5,000-acre plantation. Construction was done mostly by local masons and carpenters, assisted by Jefferson's slaves. He moved into the South Pavilion in 1770. Turning Monticello into a neoclassical masterpiece in the Palladian style was his perennial project. On January 1, 1772, Jefferson married his third cousin Martha Wales Skelton, the 23-year-old widow of Bathurst Skelton, and she moved into the South Pavilion. She was a frequent hostess for Jefferson and managed the large household. Biographer Dumas Malone described the marriage as the happiest period of Jefferson's life. Martha read widely, did fine needlework, and was a skilled pianist. Jefferson often accompanied her on the violin or cello. During their 10 years of marriage, Martha bore 6 children: Martha Patsy, 1772-1836, Jane, 1774-1775, a son who lived for only a few weeks in 1777, Mary Wales Polly, 1778-1804, Lucy Elizabeth, 1780-1781, and another Lucy Elizabeth, 1782-1785. Only Martha and Mary survived more than a few years. Martha's father John Wales died in 1773, and the couple inherited 135 slaves, 11,000 acres, 4,500 ha, 17 square miles, and the estate's debts. The debts took Jefferson years to satisfy, contributing to his financial problems. Martha later suffered from ill health, including diabetes, and frequent childbirth further weakened her. Her mother had died young, and Martha lived with 2 stepmothers as a girl. A few months after the birth of her last child, she died on September 6, 1782, at the age of 33 with Jefferson at her bedside. Shortly before her death, Martha made Jefferson promise never to marry again, telling him that she could not bear to have another mother raise her children. Jefferson was grief-stricken by her death, relentlessly pacing back and forth, nearly to the point of exhaustion. He emerged after 3 weeks, taking long rambling rides on secluded roads with his daughter Martha, by her description a solitary witness to many a violent burst of grief. After working as Secretary of State, 1790-93, he returned to Monticello and initiated a remodeling based on the architectural concepts which he had acquired in Europe. The work continued throughout most of his presidency, being finished in 1809. Political career 1775-1800. Declaration of Independence. Jefferson was the primary author of the Declaration of Independence. At age 33, he was one of the youngest delegates to the Second Continental Congress beginning in 1775 at the outbreak of the American Revolutionary War, where a formal declaration of independence from Britain was overwhelmingly favored. Jefferson chose his words for the declaration in June 1775, shortly after the war had begun, where the idea of independence from Britain had long since become popular among the colonies. He was inspired by the Enlightenment ideals of the sanctity of the individual, as well as by the writings of Locke and Montesquieu. He sought out John Adams, an emerging leader of the Congress. They became close friends, and Adams supported Jefferson's appointment to the Committee of Five formed to draft a Declaration of Independence in furtherance of the Lee Resolution passed by the Congress, which declared the United Colonies independent. The committee initially thought that Adams should write the document, but Adams persuaded the committee to choose Jefferson. Jefferson consulted with other committee members over the next 17 days, and drew on his own proposed draft of the Virginia Constitution, George Mason's draft of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, and other sources. The other committee members made some changes, and a final draft was presented to the Congress on June 28, 1776. The Declaration was introduced on Friday, June 28, and the Congress began debate over its contents on Monday, July 1, resulting in the omission of a fourth of the text, including a passage critical of King George III and the slave trade. Jefferson resented the changes, but he did not speak publicly about the revisions. On July 4, 1776, the Congress ratified the Declaration, and delegates signed it on August 2. In doing so, they were committing an act of treason against the Crown. Jefferson's preamble is regarded as an enduring statement of human rights, and the phrase "all men are created equal" has been called one of the best-known sentences in the English language, containing the most potent and consequential words in American history. Virginia State Legislator and Governor. At the start of the Revolution, Jefferson was a colonel and was named commander of the Albemarle County Militia on September 26, 1775. He was then elected to the Virginia House of Delegates for Albemarle County in September 1776, when finalizing a state constitution was a priority. For nearly 3 years, he assisted with the Constitution and was especially proud of his bill for establishing religious freedom, which forbade state support of religious institutions or enforcement of religious doctrine. The bill failed to pass, as did his legislation to disestablish the Anglican Church, but both were later revived by James Madison. In 1778, Jefferson was given the task of revising the state's laws. He drafted 126 bills in 3 years, including laws to streamline the judicial system. Jefferson's proposed statutes provided for general education, which he considered the basis of Republican government. He had become alarmed that Virginia's powerful landed gentry were becoming an hereditary aristocracy. He took the lead in abolishing what he called feudal and unnatural distinctions. He targeted laws such as entail and primogeniture, by which the oldest son inherited all the land. The entail laws made it perpetual; the one who inherited the land could not sell it, but had to bequeath it to his oldest son. As a result, increasingly large plantations, worked by white tenant farmers and by black slaves, gained in size and wealth and political power in the eastern, tidewater, tobacco areas. During the Revolutionary era, all such laws were repealed by the states that had them. Jefferson was elected governor for 1-year terms in 1779 and 1780. He transferred the state capital from Williamsburg to Richmond, and introduced measures for public education, religious freedom, and revision of inheritance laws. During General Benedict Arnold's 1781 invasion of Virginia, Jefferson escaped Richmond just ahead of the British forces, and the city was burned to the ground. General Charles Cornwallis that spring dispatched a cavalry force led by Bonastre Tarleton to capture Jefferson and members of the Assembly at Monticello, but Jack Jout of the Virginia militia thwarted the British plan. Jefferson escaped to Poplar Forest, his plantation to the west. When the General Assembly reconvened in June 1781, it conducted an inquiry into Jefferson's actions, which eventually concluded that Jefferson had acted with honor, but he was not re-elected. In April of the same year, his daughter Lucy died at age 1. A second daughter of that name was born the following year, but she died at age 3. Notes on the state of Virginia. Jefferson received a letter of inquiry in 1780 about the geography, history, and government of Virginia from French diplomat François Barbe Marbois, who was gathering data on the United States. Jefferson included his written responses in a book, Notes on the State of Virginia, 1785. He compiled the book over 5 years, including reviews of scientific knowledge, Virginia's history, politics, laws, culture, and geography. The book explores what constitutes a good society, using Virginia as an exemplar. Jefferson included extensive data about the state's natural resources and economy, and wrote at length about slavery, miscegenation, and his belief that blacks and whites could not live together as free people in one society because of justified resentments of the enslaved. He also wrote of his views on the American Indian and considered them as equals in body and mind to European settlers. Notes was first published in 1785 in French and appeared in English in 1787. Biographer George Tucker considered the work surprising in the extent of the information which a single individual had been thus able to acquire, as to the physical features of the state, and Merrill D. Peterson described it as an accomplishment for which all Americans should be grateful. Member of Congress. The United States formed a Congress of the Confederation following victory in the Revolutionary War and a peace treaty with Great Britain in 1783. To which Jefferson was appointed as a Virginia delegate. He was a member of the committee setting foreign exchange rates and recommended an American currency based on the decimal system which was adopted. He advised formation of the Committee of the States to fill the power vacuum when Congress was in recess. The committee met when Congress adjourned, but disagreements rendered it dysfunctional. In the Congress's 1783-84 session, Jefferson acted as chairman of committees to establish a viable system of government for the new republic and to propose a policy for the settlement of the Western territories. Jefferson was the principal author of the Land Ordinance of 1784, whereby Virginia ceded to the national government the vast area that it claimed northwest of the Ohio River. He insisted that this territory should not be used as colonial territory by any of the 13 states, but that it should be divided into sections which could become states. He plotted borders for 9 new states in their initial stages and wrote an ordinance banning slavery in all the nation's territories. Congress made extensive revisions, including rejection of the ban on slavery. The provisions banning slavery were known later as the Jefferson Proviso. They were modified and implemented 3 years later in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 and became the law for the entire Northwest. Minister to France. Jefferson was sent by the Congress of the Confederation to join Benjamin Franklin and John Adams as ministers in Europe for negotiation of trade agreements with England, Spain, and France. Some believed that the recently widowed Jefferson was depressed and that the assignment would distract him from his wife's death. With his young daughter Patsy and 2 servants, he departed in July 1784, arriving in Paris the next month. French Foreign Minister Count de Vergennes commented, "You replace Monsieur Franklin, I hear." Jefferson replied, "I succeed. No man can replace him." Franklin resigned as minister in March 1785 and departed in July. Jefferson had Patsy educated at the Pentamont Abbey. In 1786, he met and fell in love with Maria Causeway, an accomplished and married Italian-English musician of 27. They saw each other frequently over a period of 6 weeks. She returned to Great Britain, but they maintained a lifelong correspondence. Jefferson sent for his youngest surviving child, 9-year-old Polly, in June 1787. He also brought some of his slaves with him to Paris, including James Hemings, whom he had trained in French cuisine, and James's younger sister Sally Hemings. According to Sally's son, Madison Hemings, the 16-year-old Sally and Jefferson began a sexual relationship in Paris, where she became pregnant. According to this story, Hemmings agreed to return to the United States only after Jefferson promised to free her children when they came of age. While in France, he became a regular companion of the Marquis de Lafayette, a French hero of the American Revolutionary War, and Jefferson used his influence to procure trade agreements with France. As the French Revolution began, Jefferson allowed his Paris residence, the Hôtel de Langeac, to be used for meetings by Lafayette and other Republicans. He was in Paris during the storming of the Bastille and consulted with Lafayette while the latter drafted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Jefferson often found his mail opened by postmasters, so he invented his own enciphering device, the wheel cipher. He wrote important communications in code for the rest of his career. Jefferson left Paris in September 1789, intending to return soon. However, President George Washington appointed him the country's first Secretary of State, forcing him to remain. Jefferson remained a firm supporter of the French Revolution, while opposing its more violent elements. Secretary of State. Soon after returning from France, Jefferson accepted Washington's invitation to serve as Secretary of State. Jefferson had initially expected to return to France, but Washington insisted that he be on his new cabinet. Pressing issues at this time were the national debt and the permanent location of the capital. Jefferson opposed a national debt, preferring that each state retire its own, in contrast to Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton, who desired consolidation of various states' debts by the federal government. Hamilton also had bold plans to establish the national credit and a national bank, but Jefferson strenuously opposed this and attempted to undermine his agenda, which nearly led Washington to dismiss him from his cabinet. Jefferson later left the cabinet voluntarily. Washington never forgave him, and never spoke to him again. The second major issue was the capital's permanent location. Hamilton favored a capital close to the major commercial centers of the Northeast, while Washington, Jefferson, and other agrarians wanted it located to the south. After lengthy deadlock, the Compromise of 1790 was struck, permanently locating the capital on the Potomac River, and the federal government assumed the war debts of all 13 states. In the spring of 1791, Jefferson and Congressman James Madison took a vacation to Vermont. Jefferson had been suffering from migraines and he was tired of Hamilton infighting. In May 1792, Jefferson was alarmed at the political rivalries taking shape. He wrote to Washington, urging him to run for re-election that year as a unifying influence. He urged the president to rally the citizenry to a party that would defend democracy against the corrupting influence of banks and moneyed interests, as espoused by the Federalists. Historians recognize this letter as the earliest delineation of Democratic-Republican Party principles. Jefferson, Madison, and other Democratic-Republican organizers favored states' rights and local control and opposed federal concentration of power, whereas Hamilton sought more power for the federal government. Jefferson supported France against Britain when the two nations fought in 1793, though his arguments in the cabinet were undercut by French Revolutionary envoy Edmond Charles Genet's open scorn for President Washington. In his discussions with British Minister George Hammond, Jefferson tried unsuccessfully to persuade the British to acknowledge their violation of the Treaty of Paris, to vacate their posts in the Northwest, and to compensate the U.S. for slaves whom the British had freed at the end of the war. Seeking a return to private life, Jefferson resigned the cabinet position in December 1793, perhaps to bolster his political influence from outside the administration. After the Washington administration negotiated the Jay Treaty with Great Britain, 1794, Jefferson saw a cause around which to rally his party and organized a national opposition from Monticello. The treaty, designed by Hamilton, aimed to reduce tensions and increase trade. Jefferson warned that it would increase British influence and subvert republicanism, calling it the boldest act ever ventured on to undermine the government. The treaty passed, but it expired in 1805 during Jefferson's administration and was not renewed. Jefferson continued his pro-French stance. During the violence of the Reign of Terror, he declined to disavow the revolution. To back away from France would be to undermine the cause of republicanism in America. Election of 1796 and Vice Presidency. In the presidential campaign of 1796, Jefferson lost the Electoral College vote to Federalist John Adams by 71-68 and was elected vice president because of a mistake in voting for Adams' running mate. As presiding officer of the Senate, he assumed a more passive role than his predecessor John Adams. He allowed the Senate to freely conduct debates and confined his participation to procedural issues, which he called an honorable and easy role. Jefferson had previously studied parliamentary law and procedure for 40 years, making him unusually well qualified to serve as presiding officer. In 1800, he published his assembled notes on Senate procedure as a manual of parliamentary practice. Jefferson held 4 confidential talks with French consul Joseph Letum in the spring of 1797 where he attacked Adams, predicting that his rival would serve only one term. He also encouraged France to invade England, and advised Letum to stall any American envoys sent to Paris by instructing him to listen to them and then drag out the negotiations at length and mollify them by the urbanity of the proceedings. This toughened the tone that the French government adopted toward the Adams administration. After Adams' initial peace envoys were rebuffed, Jefferson and his supporters lobbied for the release of papers related to the incident, called the XYZ affair after the letters used to disguise the identities of the French officials involved. However, the tactic backfired when it was revealed that French officials had demanded bribes, rallying public support against France. The U.S. began an undeclared naval war with France known as the Quasi-War. During the Adams presidency, the Federalists rebuilt the military, levied new taxes, and enacted the Alien and Sedition Acts. Jefferson believed that these laws were intended to suppress Democratic Republicans, rather than prosecute enemy aliens, and considered them unconstitutional. To rally opposition, he and James Madison anonymously wrote the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, declaring that the federal government had no right to exercise powers not specifically delegated to it by the states. The resolutions followed the interposition approach of Madison, in which states may shield their citizens from federal laws that they deem unconstitutional. Jefferson advocated nullification, allowing states to invalidate federal laws altogether. Jefferson warned that, unless arrested at the threshold, the Alien and Sedition Acts would necessarily drive these states into revolution and blood. Historian Ron Chernow claims that the theoretical damage of the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions was deep and lasting, and was a recipe for disunion, contributing to the American Civil War as well as later events. Washington was so appalled by the resolutions that he told Patrick Henry that, if systematically and pertinaciously pursued, the resolutions would dissolve the Union or produce coercion. Jefferson and Madison moved to Philadelphia and founded the National Gazette in 1791, along with poet and writer Philip Freneau, in an effort to counter Hamilton's Federalist policies, which Hamilton was promoting through the influential Federalist newspaper the Gazette of the United States. The National Gazette made particular criticism of the policies promoted by Alexander Hamilton, often through anonymous essays signed by the pen name Brutus at Jefferson's urging, which were actually written by Madison. Jefferson had always admired Washington's leadership skills but felt that his Federalist Party was leading the country in the wrong direction. Jefferson thought it wise not to attend his funeral in 1799 because of acute differences with Washington while serving as Secretary of State, and remained at Monticello. Election of 1800. In the 1800 presidential election, Jefferson contended once more against Federalist John Adams. Adams' campaign was weakened by unpopular taxes and vicious Federalist infighting over his actions in the Quasi-War. Republicans pointed to the Alien and Sedition Acts and accused the Federalists of being secret monarchists, while Federalists charged that Jefferson was a godless libertine in thrall to the French. Historian Joyce Appleby said the election was one of the most acrimonious in the annals of American history. Republicans ultimately won more electoral college votes, but Jefferson and his vice presidential candidate Aaron Burr unexpectedly received an equal total. Due to the tie, the election was decided by the Federalist-dominated House of Representatives. Hamilton lobbied Federalist representatives on Jefferson's behalf, believing him a lesser political evil than Burr. On February 17, 1801, after 36 ballots, the House elected Jefferson president and Burr vice president. The win was marked by Republican celebrations throughout the country. Some of Jefferson's opponents argued that he owed his victory over Adams to the South's inflated number of electors, due to counting slaves as partial population under the Three-Fifths Compromise. Others alleged that Jefferson secured James Ashton Bayard's tie-breaking electoral vote by guaranteeing the retention of various Federalist posts in the government. Jefferson disputed the allegation, and the hist. In December 1807, Jefferson announced his intention not to seek a third term. He turned his attention increasingly to Monticello during the last year of his presidency, giving Madison and Gallatin almost total control of affairs. Shortly before leaving office in March 1809, Jefferson signed the repeal of the embargo. In its place, the Non-Intercourse Act was passed, but it proved no more effective. The day before Madison was inaugurated as his successor, Jefferson said that he felt like a prisoner, released from his chains. Retirement and later years. Following his retirement from the presidency, Jefferson continued his pursuit of educational interests. He sold his vast collection of books to the Library of Congress, and founded and built the University of Virginia. Jefferson continued to correspond with many of the country's leaders, and the Monroe Doctrine bears a strong resemblance to solicited advice that Jefferson gave to Monroe in 1823. As he settled into private life at Monticello, Jefferson developed a daily routine of rising early. He would spend several hours writing letters, with which he was often deluged. In the midday, he would often inspect the plantation on horseback. In the evenings, his family enjoyed leisure time in the gardens. Late at night, Jefferson would retire to bed with a book. However, his routine was often interrupted by uninvited visitors and tourists eager to see the icon in his final days, turning Monticello into a virtual hotel. University of Virginia. Jefferson envisioned a university free of church influences where students could specialize in many new areas not offered at other colleges. He believed that education engendered a stable society, which should provide publicly funded schools accessible to students from all social strata, based solely on ability. He initially proposed his university in a letter to Joseph Priestley in 1800 and, in 1819, the 76-year-old Jefferson founded the University of Virginia. He organized the state legislative campaign for its charter and, with the assistance of Edmund Bacon, purchased the location. He was the principal designer of the buildings, planned the university's curriculum, and served as the first rector upon its opening in 1825. Jefferson was a strong disciple of Greek and Roman architectural styles, which he believed to be most representative of American democracy. Each academic unit, called a pavilion, was designed with a two-story temple front, while the library rotunda was modeled on the Roman Pantheon. Jefferson referred to the university's grounds as the academical village, and he reflected his educational ideas in its layout. The 10 pavilions included classrooms and faculty residences, they formed a quadrangle and were connected by colonnades, behind which stood the students' rows of rooms. Gardens and vegetable plots were placed behind the pavilions and were surrounded by serpentine walls, affirming the importance of the agrarian lifestyle. The university had a library rather than a church at its center, emphasizing its secular nature, a controversial aspect at the time. When Jefferson died in 1826, James Madison replaced him as rector. Jefferson bequeathed most of his library to the university. Reconciliation with Adams. Jefferson and John Adams had been good friends in the first decades of their political careers, serving together in the Continental Congress in the 1770s and in Europe in the 1780s. The Federalist/Republican split of the 1790s divided them, however, and Adams felt betrayed by Jefferson's sponsorship of partisan attacks, such as those of James Callender. Jefferson, on the other hand, was angered at Adams for his appointment of midnight judges. The two men did not communicate directly for more than a decade after Jefferson succeeded Adams as president. A brief correspondence took place between Abigail Adams and Jefferson after Jefferson's daughter Polly died in 1804, in an attempt at reconciliation unknown to Adams. However, an exchange of letters resumed open hostilities between Adams and Jefferson. As early as 1809, Benjamin Rush, signer of the Declaration of Independence, desired that Jefferson and Adams reconcile and began to prod the two through correspondence to re-establish contact. In 1812, Adams wrote a short New Year's greeting to Jefferson, prompted earlier by Rush, to which Jefferson warmly responded. Thus began what historian David McCullough calls one of the most extraordinary correspondences in American history. Over the next 14 years, the former presidents exchanged 158 letters discussing their political differences, justifying their respective roles in events, and debating the Revolution's import to the world. When Adams died, his last words included an acknowledgement of his longtime friend and rival, Thomas Jefferson survives, unaware that Jefferson had died several hours before. Autobiography. In 1821, at the age of 77, Jefferson began writing his autobiography, in order to state some recollections of dates and facts concerning myself. He focused on the struggles and achievements he experienced until July 29, 1790, where the narrative stopped short. He excluded his youth, emphasizing the Revolutionary era. He related that his ancestors came from Wales to America in the early 17th century and settled in the western frontier of the Virginia colony, which influenced his zeal for individual and state rights. Jefferson described his father as uneducated, but with a strong mind and sound judgment. His enrollment in the College of William and Mary and election to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia in 1775 were included. He also expressed opposition to the idea of a privileged aristocracy made up of large land-owning families partial to the king, and instead promoted the aristocracy of virtue and talent, which nature has wisely provided for the direction of the interests of society, and scattered with equal hand through all its conditions, was deemed essential to a well-ordered republic. Jefferson gave his insight about people, politics, and events. The work is primarily concerned with the Declaration and reforming the government of Virginia. He used notes, letters, and documents to tell many of the stories within the autobiography. He suggested that this history was so rich that his personal affairs were better overlooked, but he incorporated a self-analysis using the Declaration and other patriotism. Lafayette's Visit. In the summer of 1824, the Marquis de Lafayette accepted an invitation from President James Monroe to visit the country. Jefferson and Lafayette had not seen each other since 1789. After visits to New York, New England, and Washington, Lafayette arrived at Monticello on November 4. Jefferson's grandson Randolph was present and recorded the reunion, as they approached each other, their uncertain gait quickened itself into a shuffling run, and exclaiming, "Ah, Jefferson! Ah, Lafayette!" they burst into tears as they fell into each other's arms. Jefferson and Lafayette then retired to the house to reminisce. The next morning Jefferson, Lafayette, and James Madison attended a tour and banquet at the University of Virginia. Jefferson had someone else read a speech he had prepared for Lafayette, as his voice was weak and could not carry. This was his last public presentation. After an 11-day visit, Lafayette bid Jefferson goodbye and departed Monticello. Final days, death, and burial. Jefferson's approximately $100,000 of debt weighed heavily on his mind in his final months, as it became increasingly clear that he would have little to leave to his heirs. In February 1826, he successfully applied to the General Assembly to hold a public lottery as a fundraiser. His health began to deteriorate in July 1825, due to a combination of rheumatism from arm and wrist injuries, as well as intestinal and urinary disorders, and, by June 1826, he was confined to bed. On July 3, Jefferson was overcome by fever and declined an invitation to Washington to attend an anniversary celebration of the Declaration. During the last hours of his life, he was accompanied by family members and friends. On July 4 at 12:50 p.m., Jefferson died at age 83 on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and just a few hours before the death of John Adams. When Adams died, his last words included an acknowledgement of his longtime friend and rival, Thomas Jefferson survives, though Adams was unaware that Jefferson had died several hours before. The sitting president was Adams' son John Quincy, and he called the coincidence of their deaths on the nation's anniversary visible and palpable remarks of divine favor. Shortly after Jefferson had died, attendants found a gold locket on a chain around his neck, where it had rested for more than 40 years, containing a small faded blue ribbon which tied a lock of his wife Martha's brown hair. Jefferson's remains were buried at Monticello, under a self-written epitaph. Here was buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of American Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. Jefferson died deeply in debt, unable to pass on his estate freely to his heirs. He gave instructions in his will for disposal of his assets, including the freeing of Sally Hemings' children, but his estate, possessions, and slaves were sold at public auctions starting in 1827. In 1831, Monticello was sold by Martha Jefferson Randolph and the other heirs. Political, social, and religious views. Jefferson subscribed to the political ideals expounded by John Locke, Francis Bacon, and Isaac Newton, whom he considered the three greatest men that ever lived. He was also influenced by the writings of Gibbon, Hume, Robertson, Bolingbroke, Montesquieu, and Voltaire. Jefferson thought that the independent yeoman and agrarian life were ideals of republican virtues. He distrusted cities and financiers, favored decentralized government power, and believed that the tyranny that had plagued the common man in Europe was due to corrupt political establishments and monarchies. He supported efforts to disestablish the Church of England, wrote the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and he pressed for a wall of separation between church and state. The Republicans under Jefferson were strongly influenced by the 18th-century British Whig Party, who believed in limited government. His Democratic Republican Party became dominant in early American politics, and his views became known as Jeffersonian democracy. Society and government. According to Jefferson's philosophy, citizens have certain inalienable rights and rightful liberty is unobstructed action according to our will, within limits drawn around us by the equal rights of others. A staunch advocate of the jury system to protect people's liberties, he proclaimed in 1801, "I consider as the only anchor yet imagined by man, by which a government can be held to the principles of its constitution." Jeffersonian government not only prohibited individuals in society from infringing on the liberty of others, but also restrained itself from diminishing individual liberty as a protection against tyranny from the majority. Initially, Jefferson favored restricted voting to those who could actually have free exercise of their reason by escaping any corrupting dependence on others. He advocated enfranchising a majority of Virginians, seeking to expand suffrage to include yeoman farmers who owned their own land while excluding tenant farmers, city day laborers, vagrants, most Amerindians, and women. He was convinced that individual liberties were the fruit of political equality, which were threatened by arbitrary government. Excesses of democracy in his view were caused by institutional corruptions rather than human nature. He was less suspicious of a working democracy than many contemporaries. As president, Jefferson feared that the Federalist system enacted by Washington and Adams had encouraged corrupting patronage and dependence. He tried to restore a balance between the state and federal governments more nearly reflecting the Articles of Confederation, seeking to reinforce state prerogatives where his party was in a majority. Jefferson was steeped in the British Whig tradition of the oppressed majority set against a repeatedly unresponsive court party in the Parliament. He justified small outbreaks of rebellion as necessary to get monarchical regimes to amend oppressive measures compromising popular liberties. In a Republican regime ruled by the majority, he acknowledged it will often be exercised when wrong. But the remedy is to set them right as to facts, pardon, and pacify them. As Jefferson saw his party triumph in 2 terms of his presidency and launch into a 3rd term under James Madison, his view of the U.S. as a continental republic and an empire of liberty grew more upbeat. On departing the presidency in 1809, he described America as trusted with the destinies of this solitary republic of the world, the only monument of human rights, and the sole depository of the sacred fire of freedom and self-government. Democracy. Jefferson considered democracy to be the expression of society, and promoted national self-determination, cultural uniformity, and education of all males of the Commonwealth. He supported public education and a free press as essential components of a democratic nation. After resigning as Secretary of State in 1795, Jefferson focused on the electoral bases of the Republicans and Federalists. The Republican classification for which he advocated included the entire body of landholders everywhere and the body of laborers without land. Republicans united behind Jefferson as vice president, with the election of 1796 expanding democracy nationwide at grassroots levels. Jefferson promoted Republican candidates for local offices. Beginning with Jefferson's electioneering for the Revolution of 1800, his political efforts were based on egalitarian appeals. In his later years, he referred to the 1800 election as real a revolution in the principles of our government as that of 76 was in its form, one not effected indeed by the sword, but by the suffrage of the people. Voter participation grew during Jefferson's presidency, increasing to unimaginable levels compared to the Federalist era, with turnout of about 67,000 in 1800 rising to about 143,000 in 1804. At the onset of the Revolution, Jefferson accepted William Blackstone's argument that property ownership would sufficiently empower voters' independent judgment, but he sought to further expand suffrage by land distribution to the poor. In the heat of the Revolutionary era and afterward, several states expanded voter eligibility from landed gentry to all propertied male, tax-paying citizens with Jefferson's support. In retirement, he gradually became critical of his home state for violating the principle of equal political rights, the social right of universal male suffrage. He sought a general suffrage of all taxpayers and militiamen, an equal representation by population in the General Assembly to correct preferential treatment of the slave-holding regions. Religion. Baptized in his youth, Jefferson became a governing member of his local Episcopal church in Charlottesville, which he later attended with his daughters. Influenced by deist authors during his college years, Jefferson abandoned Orthodox Christianity after his review of New Testament teachings. In 1803 he asserted, "I am Christian," in the only sense in which wished anyone to be. Jefferson later defined being a Christian as one who followed the simple teachings of Jesus. Jefferson compiled Jesus' biblical teachings, omitting miraculous or supernatural references. He titled the work The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth, known today as the Jefferson Bible. Peterson states Jefferson was a theist whose God was the creator of the universe, all the evidences of nature testified to his perfection, and man could rely on the harmony and beneficence of his work. Jefferson was firmly anti-clerical, writing in every age, "The priest has been hostile to liberty, they have perverted the purest religion ever preached to man into mystery and jargon." The full letter to Horatio Spafford can be read at the National Archives. Jefferson once supported banning clergy from public office but later relented. In 1777, he drafted the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. Ratified in 1786, it made compelling attendance or contributions to any state-sanctioned religious establishment illegal and declared that men shall be free to profess their opinions in matters of religion. The statute is one of only 3 accomplishments he chose to have inscribed in the epitaph on his gravestone. Early in 1802, Jefferson wrote to the Danbury, Connecticut Baptist Association, that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God. He interpreted the First Amendment as having built a wall of separation between church and state. The phrase separation of church and state has been cited several times by the Supreme Court in its interpretation of the Establishment Clause. Jefferson donated to the American Bible Society, saying the 4 evangelists delivered a pure and sublime system of morality to humanity. He thought Americans would rationally create a Puritan religion, extracting the best traditions of every denomination. And he contributed generously to several local denominations nearby Monticello. Acknowledging organized religion would always be factored into political life for good or ill, he encouraged reason over supernatural revelation to make inquiries into religion. He believed in a creator God, an afterlife, and the sum of religion as loving God and neighbors. But he also controversially renounced the conventional Christian Trinity, denying Jesus' divinity as the Son of God. Jefferson's unorthodox religious beliefs became an important issue in the 1800 presidential election. Federalists attacked him as an atheist. As president, Jefferson countered the accusations by praising religion in his inaugural address and attending services at the Capitol. Banks. Jefferson distrusted government banks and opposed public borrowing, which he thought created long-term debt, bred monopolies, and invited dangerous speculation as opposed to productive labor. In one letter to Madison, he argued each generation should curtail all debt within 19 years, and not impose a long-term debt on subsequent generations. In 1791, President Washington asked Jefferson, then Secretary of State, and Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury, if the Congress had the authority to create a national bank. While Hamilton believed Congress had the authority, Jefferson and Madison thought a national bank would ignore the needs of individuals and farmers, and would violate the 10th Amendment by assuming powers not granted to the federal government by the states. Jefferson used agrarian resistance to banks and speculators as the first defining principle of an opposition party, recruiting candidates for Congress on the issue as early as 1792. As president, Jefferson was persuaded by Secretary of Treasury Albert Gallatin to leave the bank intact, but sought to restrain its influence. Slavery. Jefferson lived in a planter economy largely dependent upon slavery, and as a wealthy landholder, used slave labor for his household, plantation, and workshops. He first recorded his slaveholding in 1774, when he counted 41. Over his lifetime he owned about 600 slaves. He inherited about 175 while most of the remainder were born on his plantations. Jefferson purchased slaves in order to unite their families, and he sold about 110 for economic reasons, primarily slaves from his outlying farms. Many historians have described Jefferson as a benevolent slave owner who didn't overwork his slaves by the conventions of his time, and provided them log cabins with fireplaces, food, clothing, and some household provisions, though slaves often had to make many of their own provisions. Additionally, Jefferson gave his slaves financial and other incentives while also allowing them to grow gardens and raise their own chickens. The whip was employed only in rare and extreme cases of fighting and stealing. Jefferson once said, "My first wish is that the laborers may be well treated." Jefferson did not work his slaves on Sundays and Christmas, and he allowed them more personal time during the winter months. Some scholars doubt Jefferson's benevolence, however, noting cases of excessive slave whippings in his absence. His nail factory was only staffed by child slaves, but many of those boys became tradesmen. Burwell Colbert, who started his working life as a child in Monticello's nailery, was later promoted to the supervisory position of butler. Jefferson felt slavery was harmful to both slave and master, but had reservations about releasing unprepared slaves into freedom and advocated gradual emancipation. In 1779, he proposed gradual voluntary training and resettlement to the Virginia Legislature, and 3 years later drafted legislation allowing owners to free their own slaves. In his draft of the Declaration of Independence, he included a section, stricken by other Southern delegates, criticizing King George III's role in promoting slavery in the colonies. In 1784, Jefferson proposed the abolition of slavery in all western U.S. territories, limiting slave importation to 15 years. Congress, however, failed to pass his proposal by one vote. In 1787, Congress passed the Northwest Ordinance, a partial victory for Jefferson that terminated slavery in the Northwest Territory. Jefferson freed his slave Robert Hemmings in 1794 and he freed his cook slave James Hemmings in 1796. During his presidency, Jefferson allowed the diffusion of slavery into the Louisiana Territory, hoping to prevent slave uprisings in Virginia and to prevent South Carolina secession. In 1804, in a compromise on the slavery issue, Jefferson and Congress banned domestic slave trafficking for 1 year into the Louisiana Territory. In 1806 he officially called for anti-slavery legislation terminating the import or export of slaves. Congress passed the law in 1807, taking effect in 1818. In 1819, he strongly opposed a Missouri statehood application amendment that banned domestic slave importation and freed slaves at the age of 25 on grounds it would destroy the Union. Jefferson freed his runaway slave Harriet Hemmings in 1822. Upon his death in 1826, Jefferson freed 5 male Hemmings slaves in his will. Jefferson shared the common belief of his day that blacks were mentally and physically inferior, but argued they nonetheless had innate human rights. In Notes on the State of Virginia, he created controversy by calling slavery a moral evil for which the nation would ultimately have to account to God. He therefore supported colonization plans that would transport freed slaves to another country, such as Liberia or Sierra Leone, though he recognized the impracticality of such proposals. During his presidency, Jefferson was for the most part publicly silent on the issue of slavery and emancipation, as the congressional debate over slavery and its extension caused a dangerous North-South rift among the states, with talk of a Northern Confederacy in New England. The violent attacks on white slave owners during the Haitian Revolution due to injustices under slavery supported Jefferson's fears of a race war, increasing his reservations about promoting emancipation at that time. After numerous attempts and failures to bring about emancipation, Jefferson wrote privately in an 1805 letter to William A. Burwell, "I have long since given up the expectation of any early provision for the extinguishment of slavery among us." That same year he also related this idea to George Logan, writing, "I have most carefully avoided every public act or manifestation on that subject." Historical assessment. Scholars remain divided on whether Jefferson truly condemned slavery and how he changed. Francis D. Caliano traces the development of competing emancipationist, then revisionist, and finally contextualist interpretations from the 1960s to the present. The emancipationist view, held by the various scholars at the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, Douglas L. Wilson, and others, maintains Jefferson was an opponent of slavery all his life, noting that he did what he could within the limited range of options available to him to undermine it, his many attempts at abolition legislation, the manner in which he provided for slaves, and his advocacy of their more humane treatment. The revisionist view, advanced by Paul Finkelman and others, criticizes Jefferson for racism, for holding slaves, and for acting contrary to his words, as Jefferson never freed most of his slaves, and he remained silent on the issue while he was president. Contextualists such as Joseph J. Ellis emphasize a change in Jefferson's thinking from emancipationist before 1783, noting a shift toward public passivity and procrastination on policy issues related to slavery. Jefferson seemed to yield to public opinion by 1794 as he laid the groundwork for his first presidential campaign against Adams in 1796. Jefferson-Hemings controversy. Claims that Jefferson fathered Sally Hemings' children have been debated since 1802. That year James T. Callender, after being denied a position as postmaster, alleged Jefferson had taken Hemings as a concubine and fathered several children with her. In 1998, a panel of researchers conducted a Y-DNA study of living descendants of Jefferson's uncle, Field, and of a descendant of Hemings' son, Eston Hemings. The results, published in the journal Nature, showed a match with the male Jefferson line. According to the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, since the results of the DNA tests were made public, most historians believe Jefferson had a relationship with Hemings. In 2000, the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, TJF, assembled a team of historians whose report concluded that the DNA study indicates a high probability that Thomas Jefferson fathered Eston Hemings. Other scholars maintain the evidence is insufficient to prove Jefferson's paternity conclusively. They note the possibility that additional Jefferson males, including his brother Randolph Jefferson and Randolph's 5 sons, could have fathered Eston Hemings or Sally Hemings' other children. After Thomas Jefferson's death, although not formally manumitted, Sally Hemings was allowed by Jefferson's daughter Martha to live in Charlottesville as a free woman until her death in 1835. Interests and activities. Jefferson was a farmer, obsessed with new crops, soil conditions, garden designs, and scientific agricultural techniques. His main cash crop was tobacco, but its price was usually low and it was rarely profitable. He tried to achieve self-sufficiency with wheat, vegetables, flax, corn, hogs, sheep, poultry, and cattle to supply his family, slaves, and employees, but he had cash flow problems and was always in debt. In the field of architecture, Jefferson helped popularize the Neo-Palladian style in the United States, utilizing designs for the Virginia State Capitol, the University of Virginia, Monticello, and others. Jefferson mastered architecture through self-study, using various books and classical architectural designs of the day. His primary authority was Andrea Palladio's The 4 Books of Architecture, which outlines the principles of classical design. He was interested in birds and wine, and was a noted gourmet. He was also a prolific writer and linguist, and spoke several languages. As a naturalist, he was fascinated by the Natural Bridge geological formation, and in 1774 successfully acquired the bridge by grant from George III. American Philosophical Society. Jefferson was a member of the American Philosophical Society for 35 years, beginning in 1780. Through the society he advanced the sciences and Enlightenment ideals, emphasizing that knowledge of science reinforced and extended freedom. His Notes on the State of Virginia was written in part as a contribution to the society. He became the society's third president on March 3, 1797, a few months after he was elected Vice President of the United States. In accepting, Jefferson stated, "I feel no qualification for this distinguished post but a sincere zeal for all the objects of our institution and an ardent desire to see knowledge so disseminated through the mass of mankind that it may at length reach even the extremes of society, beggars, and kings." Jefferson served as APS president for the next 18 years, including through both terms of his presidency. He introduced Meriwether Lewis to the society, where various scientists tutored him in preparation for the Lewis and Clark expedition. He resigned on January 20, 1815, but remained active through correspondence. Linguistics. Jefferson had a lifelong interest in linguistics, could speak, read and write in a number of languages, including French, Greek, Italian, and German. In his early years he excelled in classical language while at boarding school where he received a classical education in Greek and Latin. Jefferson later came to regard the Greek language as the perfect language as expressed in its laws and philosophy. While attending the College of William and Mary, he taught himself Italian. Here Jefferson first became familiar with the Anglo-Saxon language, especially as it was associated with English common law and system of government, and studied the language in a linguistic and philosophical capacity. He owned 17 volumes of Anglo-Saxon texts and grammar and later.
Please subscribe and thanks for watching.